When Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Yamada sat down to examine the intelligence reports that had been compiled by his forward reconnaissance teams, he did so with the kind of confidence that only comes from sustained, overwhelming success. For more than 2 years, Japanese fighters had controlled the skies over the Pacific with such complete authority that Allied aircraft had become little more than target practice for his pilots. The latest intelligence concerned a new American fighter that had begun appearing at Port Moresby, and as Yamada read through the specifications of this Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, he found himself actually laughing out loud at what he saw. The numbers seemed absurd. This American fighter had an empty weight of 10,000 pounds. Fully loaded, it ballooned to 17,500 pounds. The wing loading exceeded anything that Japanese aviation engineers would ever consider practical for combat operations in the Pacific theatre. Yamada turned to his assembled squadron commanders and made what seemed at the time to be an entirely reasonable observation. The Americans, he told them, had essentially built a flying locomotive. He pointed out that their own Ki-43 Hayabusa weighed a mere 3,800 pounds when empty. By the time this lumbering American behemoth managed to complete a single turn, a Japanese fighter could execute multiple reversals. Every principle of fighter design that had been validated through years of combat experience in China and throughout the Pacific suggested that this P-47 violated basic aeronautical common sense. Captain Saburo Yamamoto commanded the 11th Sentai, and when he studied the reconnaissance photographs showing these P-47s sitting on the airfield at Port Moresby, everything about the aircraft reinforced his conviction that the Americans had made a catastrophic design error. That massive radial engine cowling dominated the front of the aircraft. The wings looked thick and heavy. The fuselage appeared bulbous and ungainly. Every visual cue screamed of an aircraft that would be clumsy, slow to respond, and utterly incapable of the kind of manoeuvring that defined air combat in the Pacific. 17,500 pounds when fully loaded, he repeated to himself, shaking his head in genuine disbelief. The Americans actually expected to engage Japanese fighters with something that massive? The Ki-43 had already proven its superiority by destroying Hurricanes, P-40S, and even the twin-engined P-38 Lightning. This ungainly monster would surely be even easier prey. The mathematics supporting Japanese confidence seemed absolutely undeniable. Their Ki-43 Hayabusa, which Allied pilots had designated with the reporting name Oscar, possessed truly extraordinary maneuverability thanks to its unique butterfly combat flaps. The Mitsubishi Zero had achieved legendary status throughout the aviation world for its agility. Every piece of intelligence analysis suggested that the P-47 would be completely outmatched in the kind of turning fights that characterized virtually all air combat in the Pacific theater. In the swirling, close-quarter dogfights that developed over jungle and ocean, maneuverability determined who lived and who died. Weight determined maneuverability. And the Americans had just created the single heaviest single-engine fighter in the entire history of aviation. Major Takeo Kato had accumulated 47 combat missions over China and the Philippines, making him one of the more experienced pilots in the Japanese Army Air Force. When he examined the P-47 specifications, he did so with the eye of someone who had perfected the art of the turning fight. His pilots had become masters at drawing enemy aircraft into low-speed, high-angle engagements where the Ki-43's extraordinary maneuverability became an absolutely decisive advantage. Looking at the technical assessment of the P-47, Kato pointed out to his fellow officers that the American fighter supposedly achieved a maximum speed of 426 miles per hour, but only at an altitude of 30,000 feet. All of their actual combat, he reminded them, occurred below 20,000 feet, and usually below 15,000. At those altitudes where battles were actually fought, this tank would probably achieve perhaps 350 miles per hour at best. His Ki-43 pilots, he confidently predicted, would dance circles around it like hawks harassing a condor. The confidence expressed by these Japanese officers wasn't merely empty bravado or nationalist propaganda. Their combat record provided substantial justification for every assumption they made. From December 7, 1941 onward, Japanese fighters had swept Allied air forces from Pacific skies with devastating and systematic efficiency. The destruction wrought upon American air power at Pearl Harbor, the complete annihilation of British aircraft throughout Malaya, the methodical elimination of Dutch aviation in the East Indies, all of these victories validated the Japanese belief in their tactical superiority. Their lightweight, highly maneuverable fighters, flown by superbly trained pilots who had spent years perfecting their craft, seemed genuinely invincible. What Lieutenant Colonel Yamada and his fellow officers could not possibly know was that 800 miles to the south, at Port Moresby's Jackson Field, something entirely new was taking shape. Colonel Neil Kirby commanded the 348th Fighter Group, and he had been developing revolutionary tactics specifically designed to negate every single advantage that the Japanese believed they possessed. These weren't theoretical exercises dreamed up in a classroom. They were practical, combat-focused solutions born from careful, analytical study of Japanese strengths and weaknesses. Within 6 months, the aircraft that Japanese pilots were currently mocking as a flying tank would be shooting down Ki-43s at ratios that would absolutely shatter Japanese confidence in their air superiority doctrine. Within a year, surviving Japanese pilots would flee in terror at the mere sight of P-47s approaching from altitude. The entire mathematical equation of aerial combat was about to be completely rewritten through a combination of 2,000 horsepower, 850 caliber machine guns, and tactics that transformed weight into kinetic energy, altitude into potential death, and the flying tank into the single most feared fighter aircraft operating anywhere in the Southwest Pacific. The confidence radiating from Japanese pilots stemmed from 3 years of absolutely spectacular success in combat. Since the war in China had begun back in 1937, Japanese fighter doctrine had evolved around one fundamental, seemingly unshakable principle. The aircraft that could outturn its opponent would win the engagement. This philosophy had been validated repeatedly through combat after combat after combat. Over China, Ki-27 Nate fighters had swept Chinese air forces from the sky with contemptuous ease. The Chinese, flying obsolete Russian designs and early American export models, simply couldn't match the combination of Japanese aircraft performance and pilot skill. When British Commonwealth forces engaged Japanese fighters over Malaya and Burma in 1941 and 42, their Brewster Buffaloes and Hawker Hurricanes fell in droves to the nimble Ki-43s. The massacre had been so complete, so one-sided, that Allied pilots received orders to avoid combat with Japanese fighters whenever possible, a humiliating admission of inferiority that spoke volumes about the tactical reality. Sergeant Satoshi Anabuki would eventually become the highest-scoring Ki-43 ace of the entire war with 39 confirmed victories, and he remembered those early days over Burma with absolute clarity. The British Hurricane, he explained, was actually faster in straight and level flight than the Ki-43. But the moment those British pilots tried to turn with Japanese fighters, they were finished. Japanese pilots could get on a Hurricane's tail in 2 turns, sometimes even less. The British aircraft had absolutely no answer to Japanese maneuverability. The Japanese pilots would dance through the sky while their opponents struggled like elephants attempting to waltz. The statistical record supported Anabuki's memories with emphatic clarity. During just the first 4 months of 1942, the 64th Sentai alone claimed 170 Allied aircraft destroyed, while losing only 27 Ki-43s. The kill ratio seemed to prove beyond any reasonable doubt the absolute superiority of Japanese design philosophy. Lightweight, maneuverable fighters flown by highly trained pilots would always defeat heavier, faster opponents. This wasn't just a tactical preference anymore. It had evolved into something approaching religious doctrine within the Japanese Army Air Force. Japanese naval aviators flying the Mitsubishi A6M0 had reached identical conclusions through their own combat experience. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima was a combat veteran of both Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, and in a tactical briefing conducted in 1943, he stated with absolute conviction that American pilots flew like accountants, by the book, predictably, without imagination. They relied on armor and firepower, he argued, because they lacked the fundamental skill required for true aerial combat. When American pilots encountered Japanese fighters, their instinct was to try diving away. Sometimes they escaped. When they tried to actually fight, they always lost. American aircraft, Nakajima declared, were designed by engineers who had never seen combat, who had never felt what he called the dance of aerial battle. This assessment wasn't mere propaganda or wishful thinking born of national pride. Japanese pilots possessed legitimate, concrete reasons for their supreme confidence. The Ki-43's combat record was extraordinary by any objective measure. During the conquest of the Netherlands East Indies, a single flight of 9 Ki-43s had engaged 20 Dutch fighters over Java, destroying 11 of them without suffering a single loss. Over Rangoon in December 1941, 20 Ki-43s had fought 30 RAF fighters, claiming 18 destroyed for the loss of only 2 Japanese aircraft. These weren't inflated claims of the type that typically characterized aerial combat reporting. Allied records largely confirmed these devastating losses. The evidence seemed absolutely overwhelming that Japanese tactical doctrine represented something genuinely superior to anything the Western powers could offer. The Ki-43 achieved its remarkable maneuverability through what can only be described as obsessive weight reduction combined with innovative design features. That empty weight of just 3,803 pounds came from using the absolute thinnest aluminum skin that structural integrity would allow. Japanese designers eliminated armor protection entirely. They forewent self-sealing fuel tanks. They mounted minimal armament consisting of just 2 7.7mm machine guns, later upgraded to one 7.7mm and one 12.7mm gun. Every single component underwent scrutiny for potential weight savings. Even the pilot's seat was constructed from woven bamboo rather than metal. The butterfly combat flaps, which were unique to the Ki-43, could be deployed even at speed to dramatically reduce turning radius, allowing the fighter to reverse direction with almost impossible quickness. These flaps provided the Ki-43 with a turning advantage over every single Allied fighter then in service. Captain Yohei Hinoki survived the war with 12 victories, and he explained the Ki-43's advantage with the enthusiasm of someone describing a beloved tool perfected through long use. Japanese pilots could hang their aircraft on the propeller, he said, nearly motionless in the air, and still maintain complete control. American fighters would stall and spin if they even attempted to match such performance. At low speeds, Japanese fighters were genuinely invincible. The key to victory lay in forcing combat into their realm, below 200 miles per hour, where weight became a liability rather than an advantage. Hinoki and his fellow pilots called it dancing in the air. The Americans, he observed with a mixture of pity and contempt, simply couldn't dance. Japanese pilots had studied American aircraft extensively, analyzing captured examples and interrogating prisoners of war. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, which served as the workhorse of Allied air forces throughout 1942, weighed 6,000 pounds empty and couldn't match the Ki-43's climb rate or turning ability. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, with its unconventional mid-mounted engine placement, had proven so inadequate in combat that American pilots themselves called it the Iron Dog, more dangerous to its own pilots than to the enemy. Even the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and impressive firepower, had fallen regularly to Ki-43s over New Guinea during 1942. The P-38's size and complexity made it vulnerable in the close-quarter combat that Japanese pilots excelled at initiating and controlling. Intelligence officer Major Hiroshi Onishi had compiled comprehensive combat reports demonstrating that from December 1941 through June 1942-1943, Ki-43 units claimed 550 Allied aircraft destroyed throughout the Pacific Theatre, while losing approximately 130 of their own. even accounting for the typical overclaiming that characterized aerial combat reporting on all sides. The ratio strongly favored the Japanese approach to fighter design. The evidence seemed absolutely conclusive. Lightweight, maneuverable fighters would always defeat heavier opponents in the Pacific theater. But the P-47 Thunderbolt represented something entirely different from anything Japanese military analysts had encountered before. It embodied industrial warfare applied to fighter aviation with absolutely ruthless efficiency. Where Japanese designers had pursued perfection through minimalism and weight reduction, Republic Aviation's Alexander Kartveli had pursued dominance through sheer excess. The P-47's Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, with later versions achieving 2,300 horsepower using water injection. This represented more than double the 980 horsepower generated by the Ki-43's Nakajima Ha-25 engine. Such a massive power plant required an equally massive airframe, resulting in dimensions that absolutely dwarfed every other single-engine fighter of the entire war. The development history of the P-47 represented American industrial philosophy perfectly distilled. When the Army Air Corps issued specifications for a new fighter in 1940, Republic Aviation didn't even attempt to build the lightest or most maneuverable aircraft possible. Instead, they built the most powerful, most heavily armed, most survivable fighter that contemporary technology would allow. The turbo supercharger system alone weighed more than some entire Japanese aircraft engines, but it allowed the P-47 to maintain power at altitudes where other fighters were literally gasping for air. The first P-47s arrived in Brisbane, Australia on June 14, 1943, assigned to the 348th Fighter Group commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby. The aircraft had been shipped as deck cargo, partially disassembled, requiring extensive work to make them combat-ready. After assembly and testing at Eagle Farm Airfield, the group began the long flight to Port Moresby, arriving on June 23rd. Kirby was definitely not a typical fighter group commander. An analytical thinker who had studied engineering before joining the Army Air Corps, he immediately recognized that traditional dogfighting tactics would represent absolute suicide in the P-47. The aircraft's weight and size made it completely unsuitable for turning combat, but those same characteristics provided advantages that could be systematically exploited with proper tactics. Instead of trying to turn with Japanese fighters, Kirby determined that he would use the P-47's genuine strengths. It possessed phenomenal dive speed approaching the sound barrier. It carried heavy firepower capable of destroying any target with a brief burst. It could fight effectively above 25,000 feet, where Japanese engines struggled desperately for power. The turbo supercharger gave the P-47 a decisive advantage at altitude, maintaining sea-level power up to 25,000 feet, while Japanese fighters lost 50% of their power by 20,000 feet. Technical Sergeant William Anderson served as crew chief for the 348th Fighter Group, and he remembered the first impression these aircraft made with vivid clarity. When those jugs rolled off the transport ships, Anderson recalled, everyone thought somebody had made a terrible mistake somewhere along the supply chain. The aircraft were enormous, like flying boxcars. The propeller alone measured 13 feet in diameter, larger than the entire wingspan of some training aircraft. Pilots who had been flying P-39s and P-40 Walkers walked around these massive machines, shaking their heads in disbelief. How were they supposed to fight Zeros with something that looked like a flying barn? Some pilots actually requested transfers immediately, rather than fly what they perceived as a death trap. But Kirby possessed a vision that would fundamentally revolutionize air combat throughout the Pacific. He instituted a rigorous training program that systematically broke every established rule of conventional fighter tactics. There would be no more turning fights where individual pilot skill determined outcomes. No more low-altitude furballs where maneuverability mattered most. The P-47s would climb to 30,000 feet, patrol at high altitude exploiting their superb turbo superchargers, then dive on Japanese formations from above at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. At that velocity, the 850 caliber machine guns would unleash 100 rounds per second, each bullet capable of tearing through the Ki-43's unarmored structure like tissue paper. Before Japanese pilots could even react to the attack, the P-47s would be gone, using their tremendous speed to zoom back to altitude on momentum alone. Captain William Banks served as operations officer for the 348th, and he initially doubted these tactics completely. They had been taught since flight school, he explained, that fighter combat centered on getting onto an enemy's tail and staying there until you shot him down. Kirby was telling them to make one pass and then run away. It seemed like cowardice, like abandoning everything they understood about aerial combat. Then Kirby showed them the mathematics underlying his tactical revolution. At 450 miles per hour in a dive, a P-47 would be traveling 660 feet per second. A Ki-43 might possess a tighter turning circle, but by the time Japanese pilots started their turn in response, the P-47s would already be through their formation and climbing back to altitude. Japanese pilots literally couldn't react fast enough to counter such attacks. The training program proved both intense and revolutionary in its conception. Pilots practiced high-altitude formation flying, learning to maintain cohesion in thin air where controls became mushy and engines struggled. They practiced diving attacks, learning to judge the precise moment to open fire for maximum effect while maintaining enough speed to escape. They practiced zoom climbs, converting speed back into altitude with maximum efficiency. Most importantly, they practiced iron discipline, resisting every natural temptation to engage in turning fights where the P-47's weight would become a fatal disadvantage rather than an asset. The first major combat test came on August 16, 1943, when two squadrons from the 348th encountered Japanese fighters over Tsili Tsili airstrip. Following Kirby's tactics with precise discipline, the P-47s climbed to 28,000 feet while Japanese fighters patrolled at 15,000 feet, completely unaware of the threat positioned far above them. The Americans positioned themselves up-sun, making visual detection nearly impossible, then rolled into near-vertical dives accelerating through 400 miles per hour. The first indication Japanese pilots received of the attack was when their wingman simply exploded in mid-air. Flight Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto was flying a Ki-43 with the 68th Sentai, and he survived this encounter to file a combat report later. They were flying their standard patrol pattern, Yamamoto reported, when Suzuki's aircraft simply disintegrated without any warning whatsoever. Before they could even react or look around for the enemy, two more aircraft exploded in rapid succession. The formation scattered desperately, looking in every direction for attackers, but the Americans were already gone, climbing back to altitude at what seemed like impossible speed. The Japanese pilots could only watch helplessly as the P-47s disappeared into the sun. 3 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed without any loss to the attacking P-47s, completely validating Kirby's revolutionary tactical concepts. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds from first dive to final climb, but its impact would resonate throughout the Japanese Army Air Force for months to come. For the first time in the war, Ki-43 pilots had been rendered completely helpless, unable to bring their superior maneuverability into play at all. The real test of these new tactics came on September 4, 1943, when Kirby personally led a mission that would demonstrate the P-47's absolutely devastating potential. Taking off from Port Moresby with 3 wingmen, Kirby climbed to 31,000 feet, pushing well beyond the Ki-43's effective operational ceiling. Below them, scattered across different altitudes, were Japanese aircraft returning from a mission. Kirby studied the formation carefully, calculating angles, speeds, and escape routes with the precision of an engineer approaching a mathematical problem. Then he waggled his wings, the signal to attack. The 4 P-47s rolled inverted and pulled through into 70-degree dives. Within seconds, they were passing 400 miles per hour. At 450 miles per hour, Kirby opened fire on a Ki-43 from 1,000 yards out, walking his rounds into the target as he closed the distance. The Japanese fighter didn't just catch fire or lose control in the conventional sense. It literally disintegrated under the concentrated impact of 50 caliber rounds, with major components separating in mid-air. Kirby's momentum carried him completely through the Japanese formation before anyone could react. He pulled up hard, trading speed for altitude, and found himself above the melee again within 20 seconds, ready for another attack. Lieutenant Masahiro Ikeda was flying top cover in a P-47, and he witnessed this attack from above. The enemy came from absolutely nowhere, he later reported, falling like meteors from the sky. Tanaka's aircraft exploded before he could even call out a warning over the radio. The sound of American guns was terrifying, like sustained thunder rolling across the sky. By the time Ikeda turned to engage, the attackers were already climbing away, beyond any possible reach. The Japanese pilots were completely helpless. On October 11, 1943, the 348th Fighter Group executed a mission that would earn Neil Kirby the Medal of Honor, while definitively establishing the P-47's absolute dominance over New Guinea's skies. Leading 4 P-47s on a fighter sweep over Wewak, Kirby encountered a massive Japanese formation consisting of 12 bombers escorted by 36 fighters, primarily Ki-43s, with some newer Ki-61 Tony fighters mixed in. Traditional fighter doctrine would have called for avoiding such overwhelming numerical odds. Kirby attacked without any hesitation whatsoever. Climbing to 33,000 feet, the 4 P-47s positioned themselves perfectly for a diving attack. The Japanese formation, flying at 18,000 feet, had absolutely no idea that death was falling from directly above. Kirby selected a Ki-61 fighter positioned on the formation's edge and began his dive, accelerating through 475 miles per hour, approaching the aircraft's maximum safe diving speed. He opened fire at 800 yards. The Japanese fighter literally came apart in mid-air with major components separating under the concentrated impact of 50 caliber fire. Kirby's momentum carried him completely through the entire Japanese formation. Using his tremendous speed, he climbed back to 25,000 feet and immediately rolled into another attack. This time he targeted a Ki-43 that was attempting to climb toward him. The lightweight Japanese fighter, struggling desperately to gain altitude, sat perfectly positioned in Kirby's gun sight. A 2-second burst sent it spinning down in flames, the pilot unable to escape from the mortally wounded aircraft. For the next 8 minutes, Kirby and his wingmen executed continuous boom and zoom attacks on the increasingly disrupted Japanese formation. Kirby personally destroyed 6 enemy aircraft. His wingmen claimed 3 more. Several additional Japanese aircraft were damaged. The bomber formation, completely unprotected after their escorts were destroyed or scattered, fled in absolute disorder. Not one P-47 sustained significant damage despite being outnumbered nearly 12-1. Lieutenant Masashi Ito flew a Ki-43 in the escort formation and survived to write extensively about the encounter afterward. It was not combat as they understood it, Ito wrote. The Americans fell on them like an avalanche, striking and then disappearing before anyone could respond. Formation leaders called desperately for maintaining discipline, but there existed no defense against such tactics. Japanese pilots twisted and turned, trying desperately to bring their guns to bear on the attackers, but the enemy remained always above them, always faster, always completely out of reach. Ito personally watched 6 of their aircraft destroyed without ever seeing an American fighter in his own gun sight. It was not battle, he concluded. It was execution. The engagement over Wewak marked a fundamental and irreversible turning point in the air war over New Guinea. Japanese pilots who had entered the war with absolute confidence in their tactical superiority now faced the grim reality that their aircraft and tactics were rapidly becoming obsolete. The Ki-43, which had dominated Asian skies for 3 solid years, stood helpless against the P-47's energy tactics. Even more devastating than the mechanical disadvantage was the profound psychological impact. Japanese pilot training emphasized spirit, skill, and warrior tradition, dating directly back to the samurai. The P-47's tactics removed skill from the equation entirely, replacing it with simple physics and overwhelming firepower. Captain Tomoyuki Yoshida served as intelligence officer for the 4th Air Army, and he compiled loss statistics that revealed the catastrophic shift in combat effectiveness with brutal mathematical clarity. In the 3 months before P-47s arrived in theatre, Ki-43 units had maintained a 3-to-1 kill ratio against Allied fighters. In the 3 months after P-47s became operational, that ratio reversed to 1-to-4 against the Japanese. By December 1943, it had deteriorated further to 1-to-6. These weren't just abstract statistics. They represented the systematic destruction of Japan's most experienced and irreplaceable pilots. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures with increasing desperation as the situation deteriorated. They tried stationing fighters at 25,000 feet to intercept P-47s before they could dive, but the Ki-43's poor high-altitude performance meant they became sitting ducks for P-47s that could fight effectively at 35,000 feet. They tried forming concentrated defensive formations, but the P-47's 8-gun armament could scatter such formations with a single devastating pass. They even attempted to lure P-47s into low-altitude combat by using decoy aircraft, but American pilots maintained absolutely rigid discipline, refusing to abandon their altitude advantage for any reason whatsoever. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka flew Ki-43s and survived an incredible 73 combat missions, and he later reflected with remarkable honesty about the hopeless situation. They had been taught from the beginning, Tanaka explained, that the superior pilot would always prevail in combat, that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The P-47 proved conclusively that this was pure fantasy. It didn't matter how skilled you were as a pilot if the enemy attacked from an altitude you couldn't physically reach, at a speed you couldn't possibly match, with firepower that destroyed you instantly. They were samurai trying to fight machines, and machines don't care about honor or tradition. Technical analysis revealed the depth of Japanese disadvantage in stark mathematical terms that admitted no argument. The Ki-43's maximum speed at 15,000 feet was approximately 320 miles per hour. The P-47 could maintain 380 miles per hour at the same altitude and could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive without structural failure. The Ki-43's 2 machine guns fired a combined 18 rounds per second with limited armor-piercing capability. The P-47's 8 guns fired 100 rounds per second, with each bullet capable of penetrating armor plate. The Ki-43 required precise, carefully aimed shooting to damage enemy aircraft. The P-47's sheer volume of fire meant that even moderate accuracy produced absolutely devastating results. But beyond mere technical specifications, the P-47 represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy that the Japanese military establishment struggled desperately to comprehend. Japanese aircraft were essentially artisan products, each one carefully assembled by skilled workers, with pilots trained for years to achieve aerial mastery. The P-47 embodied mass production incarnate. Republic Aviation was producing 15 aircraft per day by late 1943. Pilots received 300 hours of flight training before deployment, adequate but certainly not exceptional. The American approach accepted that individual pilots and aircraft would inevitably be lost, but the overall system would prevail through overwhelming numerical and material superiority. This reality became increasingly crushing for Japanese pilots as 1943 turned to 1944. Every Ki-43 lost represented years of training and irreplaceable experience. Every P-47 lost was replaced within weeks by an improved model with a freshly trained pilot. The Americans could afford to trade losses 1 for 1, even 1 for 2. The Japanese couldn't afford to trade at any ratio whatsoever. The mathematics of attrition warfare were absolutely inexorable and completely unforgiving. By January 1944, the mere sight of P-47s caused Japanese formations to scatter and flee immediately. Radio intercepts revealed the depth of demoralization among Japanese pilots with painful clarity. The warning call, "Thunderbolts high above," triggered immediate evasive action, often aborting entire missions before any contact was even made. Japanese bomber operations over New Guinea virtually ceased because Ki-43 escorts couldn't protect them from P-47 attacks. Ground support missions became suicide runs as P-47s established standing patrols over Japanese airfields. The 348th Fighter Group's spectacular success inspired rapid tactical evolution across the entire Southwest Pacific Theater. The 35th Fighter Group converted from P-39s to P-47s in November 1943 and immediately adopted Kirby's boom and zoom tactics. The 49th Fighter Group received P-47s in December and did likewise. Within 6 months, P-47 groups had established complete and unchallengeable air superiority over New Guinea, enabling MacArthur's island-hopping campaign to accelerate dramatically beyond all planned schedules. Individual pilot accounts revealed the complete transformation in combat dynamics with vivid clarity. First Lieutenant Robert Aschenbrenner had previously flown P-39s against Ki-43s with limited success and considerable fear. His description of his first combat mission in a P-47 captured the revolutionary change. In the P-39, he explained, every single engagement with a Ki-43 was genuinely life or death, desperately trying to get a shot while simultaneously avoiding Japanese guns. In the P-47, they were essentially untouchable. They would spot Japanese fighters from 10,000 feet above, roll in, fire one burst, and zoom away before anyone could respond. The Japanese couldn't touch them. It wasn't even combat anymore, Aschenbrenner reflected. It was execution. He felt sorry for them, honestly. The Japanese response revealed growing desperation and belated recognition of their deteriorating position. The 14th Sentai received new Ki-84 Frank fighters in March 1944, aircraft specifically designed to counter the P-47's advantages with improved speed and altitude performance. But there were far too few Ki-84s, arriving far too late, flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots. The massive industrial disparity meant that for every advanced Japanese fighter produced, America was simultaneously producing 20 P-47s. Major Teruhiko Kobayashi was one of Japan's most successful fighter pilots, with 30 confirmed victories when P-47s shot him down on April 29, 1944. Rescued after parachuting into the jungle and eventually returned to duty, he reported with remarkable and painful candor that the enemy they faced now bore absolutely no resemblance to the one they had defeated in 1942. The Americans had learned to systematically exploit their material advantages while simultaneously denying the Japanese the close combat where skills mattered. The P-47, Kobayashi concluded, wasn't just an aircraft. It was a complete weapons system designed specifically to destroy Japanese fighters at ranges where they couldn't possibly respond. There existed no effective counter. Fighting P-47s was like confronting men armed with rifles while carrying only swords. The mathematics of aerial combat had indeed changed fundamentally, but not remotely in the way Japanese pilots had expected at the war's beginning, where they had calculated turning radius and rate of climb as determining factors. P-47 pilots calculated energy management and firepower density. Where Japanese pilots sought the perfect deflection shot with carefully limited ammunition, P-47 pilots saturated target areas with overwhelming firepower. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized individual warrior spirit and personal honor, American doctrine emphasized systematic efficiency achieved through superior technology and disciplined tactics. By mid-1944, the transformation was complete and absolutely irreversible. Ki-43 units that had swept Allied air forces from Asian skies in 1942 were now reduced to hit-and-run tactics, avoiding combat whenever remotely possible. Some Japanese units recorded 50% aircraft losses per month, unsustainable attrition that simply could not be replaced. Meanwhile, P-47 groups continued expanding steadily, with new aircraft arriving weekly, each one incrementally improved based on accumulated combat experience. The P-47D models arriving in mid-1944 featured bubble canopies providing improved visibility, paddle blade propellers for better climb performance, and increased ammunition capacity. The P-47's success extended far beyond direct air-to-air combat statistics. The aircraft's ability to carry 2,500 pounds of bombs made it a devastating ground attack platform. Japanese supply lines, previously protected by fighter cover and sheer distance, became absolute death traps. P-47s would sweep ahead of advancing American ground forces, systematically destroying Japanese artillery positions, supply dumps, and vehicle convoys with complete impunity. The psychological impact on Japanese ground forces proved severe. The distinctive sound of P-47 engines triggered immediate dispersal to avoid devastating strafing runs. Captain Kazuo Sato served as staff officer with the 18th Army, and he described the impact in his post-war memoir with bitter clarity. The Thunderbolts made any daylight movement completely impossible, Sato wrote. They had to move supplies exclusively at night, in small groups, constantly watching the sky in terror. Even then, the P-47s would catch them with parachute flares and attack in darkness. Japanese soldiers called them death from above because there existed no defense, no warning. The P-47s controlled not just the air, but absolutely everything beneath it. A single P-47 could paralyze an entire regiment through fear alone. Neil Kirby's death on March 5, 1944, ironically demonstrated both the P-47's tremendous strengths and the absolutely critical importance of maintaining tactical discipline at all times. Leading a three-plane patrol over Wewak, Kirby had successfully bounced a formation of Ki-43s, shooting down what would be his 22nd victory. But instead of immediately zooming back to altitude as doctrine absolutely demanded, he turned to confirm the kill, bleeding off precious speed in the turning maneuver. 3 Ki-43s from the 77th Sentai caught him at low altitude and low speed, where their maneuverability advantage suddenly mattered again. Even then, it required concentrated fire from all three aircraft to finally bring down the rugged P-47. Kirby managed to bail out successfully, but was killed by gunfire while descending in his parachute, a violation of the informal rules of aerial combat that shocked even hardened Japanese pilots. His death served as a stark reminder to all P-47 pilots that if they abandoned the tactics that made the aircraft dominant, even the mighty Thunderbolt became vulnerable to Japanese fighters. The incident powerfully reinforced tactical discipline among American pilots, who recognized with renewed clarity that the P-47's advantages disappeared completely if they attempted to dogfight like their opponents wanted. The loss of Kirby, who had virtually single-handedly created the tactics that made the P-47 successful in the Pacific, was deeply felt throughout the entire 5th Air Force. Major Tommy Maguire would eventually become the second highest-scoring American ace with 38 victories. He transitioned from P-38s to P-47s in late 1944, initially resisting the change because he preferred the Lightning's twin-engine reliability. After his very first combat mission in a P-47, he changed his mind completely. "The Jug was like flying a battleship," Maguire explained. "You didn't dance with it. You hammered with it. The Zeros and Oscars couldn't touch you if you maintained strict discipline. The moment you tried turning with them, you were dead. But if you kept your speed up and maintained your altitude advantage, you were genuinely invincible." Success wasn't about flying skill anymore, Maguire concluded. It was purely about tactical discipline. The psychological transformation among Japanese pilots was complete by early 1945. Veterans who had entered the war as confident hunters now thought only of survival. New pilots rushed through abbreviated training programs with as little as 50 hours of total flight time, were often shot down on their very first combat missions. The Ki-43, which had symbolized Japanese air superiority at the war's beginning, became known among its own pilots as the Flying Coffin. Morale collapsed completely as pilots realized they were being sent up as sacrifices merely to delay an inevitable American advance. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Ozawa transferred from Navy Zeros to Army Ki-43s due to desperate pilot shortages, and he described the hopelessness with painful honesty. Flying against P-47s was not combat in any meaningful sense, Ozawa explained. It was merely survival. Their tactics consisted entirely of avoiding contact with American fighters. If they saw P-47s above them, they fled immediately. If the P-47s dove on them, they scattered and prayed. The few times they actually tried fighting back, they were systematically slaughtered. The aircraft they had once called inferior had become their executioner. The P-47's impact extended well beyond its combat record to fundamentally influence the entire strategic situation throughout the Pacific. The aircraft proved conclusively that American industrial methods could produce weapons systems that simply overwhelmed traditional military virtues through sheer material superiority. Courage, skill, and determination meant virtually nothing against overwhelming firepower, superior altitude performance, and tactics specifically designed to negate enemy advantages. The P-47 wasn't just defeating Japanese aircraft. It was defeating the entire Japanese military philosophy that had dominated Asian warfare for decades. This transformation was clearly reflected in pilot training programs on both sides. Japanese training in 1941 emphasized aerobatics, formation flying, and precision marksmanship. Individual pilots spent years perfecting their skills, becoming genuine artists of aerial combat. By 1944, American training emphasized energy management, tactical discipline, and systems operation. Pilots needed only basic competence because the P-47's inherent advantages and proven tactics would ensure victory. The aircraft itself and its doctrine, not individual brilliance, would win the war. The final insult to Japanese fighter doctrine came with the P-47N variant, introduced in early 1945. This version, specifically designed for long-range operations across the vast Pacific, could fly 2,000-mile missions with external fuel tanks. Japanese homeland defense fighters, expecting to engage B-29 bombers exclusively, found themselves facing P-47N escorts that could fight effectively at 35,000 feet, altitudes where even the best Japanese fighters struggled desperately just to operate. Ki-43s were completely and utterly helpless against these high-altitude intruders. On April 7, 1945, P-47Ns from the 318th Fighter Group intercepted Japanese aircraft attempting to support the battleship Yamato's final suicide mission to Okinawa. In a completely one-sided massacre lasting less than 15 minutes, the P-47s destroyed 18 Japanese aircraft without suffering a single loss. The Ki-43s in the escort force never even reached firing position before being shot down. It served as a powerful symbol of how completely the tables had turned since 1942. The industrial mathematics behind the P-47's dominance were absolutely staggering and completely decisive. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47s during the war, more aircraft than all Japanese fighter types combined. Each P-47 required 30,000 man-hours to produce. Japanese aircraft required nearly 50,000 due to less efficient production methods. The American pilot training program was producing 30,000 pilots annually by 1944. Japan managed fewer than 2,000, and these were of steadily decreasing quality as experienced instructors were pulled directly into combat. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns carried 3,400 rounds total, enough ammunition for nearly 35 seconds of continuous fire. The Ki-43's two guns carried enough ammunition for less than 15 seconds of sustained fire. In a single engagement, a P-47 could deliver more total destructive power than a Ki-43 could deliver across 3 complete missions. This firepower disparity meant that even glancing hits from a P-47 often proved fatal to lightly constructed Japanese aircraft, while Ki-43s needed sustained, precisely accurate fire to damage the robust American fighter. The resilience and durability of the P-47 became absolutely legendary among both American and Japanese pilots. The aircraft's air-cooled radial engine could absorb tremendous damage and continue operating. The pilot sat protected by armor plate, bulletproof glass, and the massive engine itself acting as a shield. Numerous P-47s returned safely to base with cylinder heads shot completely off, oil lines severed, and hundreds of bullet holes riddling wings and fuselage. Captain Robert Johnson's P-47 famously survived an encounter with a German FW-190 Ace who expended his entire ammunition load attempting to shoot down the damaged Thunderbolt, only to have Johnson wave at him cheerfully as both aircraft ran completely out of ammunition. In stark contrast, the Ki-43's complete lack of armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that even rifle-caliber hits could prove instantly fatal. American pilots regularly reported seeing Ki-43s explode from single 50-caliber bullet impacts striking fuel tanks. The Japanese philosophy of saving weight by eliminating all protection had made perfect sense when facing equally vulnerable Chinese aircraft back in 1937. Against the P-47's overwhelming firepower, it was absolutely suicidal. The P-47 also revolutionized naval aviation support throughout the Pacific theater. While primarily a land-based aircraft, long-range P-47N variants began operating from captured island bases to provide additional cover for Navy operations. Their ability to engage Japanese aircraft at extreme ranges meant carrier task forces could operate with protection extending far beyond their own fighter screens. Japanese kamikaze attacks, which relied on overwhelming carrier defenses through sheer mass, found themselves intercepted by P-47s 50 miles from their intended targets. On May 25, 1945, the 318th Fighter Group flying long-range P-47s from Aishima off Okinawa intercepted a massive kamikaze formation headed directly for the American fleet. In what became known as one of the most completely one-sided air battles of the entire Pacific War, P-47s destroyed 34 Japanese aircraft in less than 20 minutes without losing a single fighter. Most of the Japanese pilots never even saw the American fleet they were supposed to attack. The Ki-43s and other obsolete aircraft comprising most of the kamikaze force were utterly helpless against P-47s attacking from above with devastating coordinated firepower. Lieutenant Yoshio Fukui was one of the few surviving Ki-43 pilots from the Philippines campaign who was reassigned to Homeland Defense in 1945. He later wrote with remarkable and painful honesty about the transformation. When he first flew the Ki-43 back in 1941, they were genuinely invincible. By 1945, flying that same aircraft type felt like nothing less than a death sentence. The Americans had systematically evolved, while Japan had stagnated completely. The P-47, which Japanese pilots had mockingly dismissed as a flying tank, had become their absolute nightmare. It could appear at any altitude, any time, and destroy them before they even knew it was there. Statistical analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey revealed the totality of Japanese defeat in fighter combat with brutal mathematical clarity. By war's end, Japan had lost approximately 38,000 aircraft of all types, with 60% destroyed in aerial combat. The overwhelming majority of these losses occurred in the war's final 2 years, precisely when P-47s and other advanced American fighters achieved absolute and unchallengeable superiority. The Ki-43, which had accounted for more Allied aircraft destroyed than any other Japanese fighter type in 1942, ended the war with pilots receiving explicit instructions to avoid combat with American fighters at all costs under any circumstances. Post-war analysis revealed the absolute completeness of the American victory in stark terms. By August 1945, The United States had 2,000 operational P-47s deployed throughout the Pacific Theater. Japan had fewer than 100 operational Ki-43s remaining, most flown by pilots with less than 100 hours total flight time. American pilots were rotating home after completing standard combat tours. Japanese pilots flew continuously until they died. American units were receiving the latest P-47N models with improvements across every system. Japanese units were desperately cannibalizing wrecked aircraft merely to keep anything flying at all. The final recorded combat between P-47s and Ki-43s occurred on August 14, 1945, exactly 1 day before Japan's official surrender. 4 P-47s from the 507 fighter group encountered 6 Ki-43s over Tokyo Bay. In a brief engagement lasting less than 2 minutes, 3 Ki-43s were destroyed without any damage whatsoever to American aircraft. It served as a fitting end to a completely one-sided relationship that had developed over 2 years. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had confidently mocked as a flying tank had systematically and methodically destroyed their entire air force. Surviving Japanese pilots proved remarkably candid in their post-war assessments when interviewed by American intelligence officers. Colonel Ichiro Yamaguchi had commanded Ki-43 units continuously from 1942 through 1945, and he testified with painful honesty. They had entered the war believing absolutely that superior pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability would ensure inevitable victory, Yamaguchi explained. The P-47 taught them conclusively that modern wars are won by superior systems, not superior individuals. It didn't matter that Japanese pilots were brave or highly skilled. The Americans had built an aircraft and developed comprehensive tactics that made Japanese advantages completely irrelevant. They had transformed aerial combat into an industrial process, and Japan had absolutely no answer. The technology gulf between the two nations was equally stark and undeniable. Post-war testing of captured Ki-43s by American test pilots revealed an aircraft that would have been genuinely competitive in 1940 standards, but was completely and hopelessly obsolete by 1943. Test pilot Major James Matthews flew a captured Ki-43-2 and filed a detailed report. The aircraft was absolutely delightful to fly, Matthews noted. Light on the controls, incredibly maneuverable, responsive. In a 1930s-style turning dogfight, it would be genuinely formidable. But actual combat had stopped being about tight turns and aerobatics when aircraft started carrying heavy armament and fighting at 400 miles per hour. The Ki-43 was perfectly designed for the wrong war entirely. Conversely, Japanese test pilots who flew captured P-47s after the war were genuinely amazed by the aircraft's capabilities. Captain Yoshio Hirose had flown Ki-43s throughout the war in multiple combat theatres, and he tested a P-47D in 1946. The power was absolutely incredible, Hirose reported. The aircraft climbed like it was falling upward. The controls were heavy compared to Japanese fighters, but remained precise and responsive. The armament was utterly devastating. When they test-fired against ground targets, those targets simply disappeared entirely. Hirose understood immediately why Japan had lost. This wasn't merely an aircraft, he concluded. It was a complete weapons platform. Absolutely everything about it was specifically designed to destroy enemies from positions of overwhelming advantage. Veterans of both sides drew profoundly different lessons from their wartime experiences. American pilots learned conclusively that technology and tactics could provide overwhelming advantages if properly employed and rigorously maintained. The P-47 taught them that discipline and strict adherence to proven methods mattered far more than individual heroics or flying skill. Japanese pilots learned the bitter lesson that courage without capability was utterly meaningless, that industrial power ultimately determined military outcomes, and that their nation's cherished military traditions had led them directly to catastrophic disaster. Major Richard Bong was America's top-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories. He flew P-38s primarily, but trained extensively with P-47s and understood their profound impact. The Thunderbolt changed absolutely everything in the Pacific, Bong explained. Before it arrived, Americans were trading punches with the Japanese, winning some engagements, losing others. After it arrived with proper tactics, it was simply no contest whatsoever. The Japanese couldn't possibly compete with that combination of firepower, speed, and altitude performance. Pilots who couldn't have survived in P-40s became aces in P-47s. It wasn't about pilot skill anymore, Bong concluded. It was purely about having the systematically better weapons system. Lieutenant Takeshi Maeda flew Ki-43s from 1942 through 1945, surviving the entire war with 4 confirmed victories. Reflecting decades later, he spoke with painful honesty. They had started the war as samurai of the sky, Maeda explained. They ended it as helpless targets. The P-47 represented everything Japanese fighters were not: heavy, brutally powerful, ruthlessly effective. It embodied American thinking perfectly. Why bother turning with an enemy when you can simply destroy him from positions where he cannot possibly reach you? Why rely on pilot skill when you can rely instead on overwhelming firepower? The Americans fought with their heads, Maeda concluded. The Japanese fought with their hearts. Hearts lose every time to cold mathematics. General George Kenney commanded Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific and provided what might serve as the epitaph for Japanese fighter aviation in World War II. The Japanese built beautiful aircraft like the Ki-43, Kenney observed. They were perfectly suited for the war Japan wanted to fight. America built the P-47, perfectly suited for the war that actually happened. The Japanese wanted aerial duels between individual warriors. America gave them industrial annihilation instead. The P-47 didn't just defeat Japanese aircraft, Kenney concluded. It defeated Japanese thinking about air warfare entirely. The last flying Ki-43 in Japanese military service was destroyed on the ground by American naval gunfire on August 18, 1945. 3 days after Japan's official surrender. The 15,683rd and final P-47 rolled off Republic Aviation's production line on December 31, 1945. One aircraft represented the end of an entire era, destroyed and utterly defeated. The other represented the dawn of American air supremacy that would dominate the following decades completely. The statistics spoke with absolute and undeniable finality. Throughout the Pacific Theater, P-47 units claimed 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, while losing only 150 of their own, a 25-to-1 kill ratio that defied every single pre-war prediction made by military analysts. The Ki-43, which had entered the war with confident expectations of maintaining Japan's aerial superiority indefinitely, ended it with negative kill ratios against every major American fighter type introduced after 1943. The Japanese pilots, who had initially dismissed the P-47 as an impossibly heavy, clumsy fighter, had learned through absolutely bitter experience that weight translated directly into diving speed. That size meant battlefield durability, and that 8 synchronized guns meant certain death. Their beautiful, agile Ki-43s, perfectly designed for the gentlemanly aerial duels they had imagined, were systematically swept from Pacific skies by an aircraft designed purely for overwhelming industrial force. The confident laughter had stopped completely at 400 miles per hour with 8 guns firing, falling from 30,000 feet like an unstoppable avalanche of American industrial might that buried everything beneath it.